Numbness started in the toes, tingling that came and went, a sensation that the sole of the foot was wrapped in something thin, the feeling dulled rather than absent. Then the other foot. Then upward, the ankle, the lower calf. Always starting at the farthest point from the spine and working its way inward, symmetric, both feet at once, as though someone were slowly pulling a stocking of numbness up from the toes. You assumed poor circulation, the phrase you heard, the explanation that seemed to account for the pattern. But circulation describes blood flow. What is failing is the nerve itself, and the nerve is failing at the toe first, because the toe is a meter from the cell body that feeds it, the farthest point on the longest supply line in the body. Your toes are approximately 1 meter from the spinal cord. A single sensory neuron spans the full distance, one cell, 1 meter long, receiving every protein, every enzyme, every mitochondrion it needs from a cell body sitting near the spine. The cell body is the factory. The axon terminus at the toe is the endpoint. Nothing is manufactured at the endpoint. Every molecule the nerve ending requires to function must travel the full meter from factory to terminus through a delivery system that takes days to complete one shipment. When that supply degrades, the distal terminus fails first. A water main serving houses along a road. When the pump weakens, the last house loses pressure before the houses near the pump. The toes are the last house. The spine is the pump. How does the cell body deliver supplies across a full meter of axon? Axonal transport. Two systems running simultaneously along microtubule rails that span the entire length of the axon like tracks in a tunnel. Fast axonal transport moves vesicles, mitochondria, and membrane components at 200 to 400 millimeters per day, carried by kinesin motor proteins that walk along the microtubule surface one step at a time, each step powered by the hydrolysis of one molecule of adenosine triphosphate. The kinesin molecule has two globular heads that alternately bind and release from the microtubule surface, walking hand over hand along the rail in 8 nanometer steps, each step consuming one ATP molecule and moving the cargo 8 nanometers closer to the terminus. At 200 to 400 millimeters per day, the motor is taking approximately 100 steps per second, each step a molecular scale event repeated billions of times across the 3 to 5 day journey from spine to toe. The microtubule rail itself must be maintained along the entire meter of axon, assembled from tubulin dimers that arrive through the slow transport system, the infrastructure that carries the cargo requiring its own slower delivery system to remain functional. The dependency is circular and distance sensitive. Fast transport needs intact microtubules to carry cargo, and intact microtubules need slow transport to deliver the tubulin subunits that maintain the rail. At the proximal end of the axon, near the cell body, both transport systems operate with short delivery distances and rapid turnover. At the distal end, a meter away, the tubulin subunits that maintain the rail take months to arrive through slow transport, and any disruption in that delivery leaves the rail degraded for the full duration of the replacement cycle. If slow transport fails at the distal end of a 1 meter axon, the microtubule rail degrades, fast transport can no longer deliver mitochondria and membrane components, and the terminus loses both its structural maintenance and its energy supply simultaneously. The circular dependency makes the endpoint the supply must reach doubly vulnerable. It is the last to receive both the infrastructure and the cargo the infrastructure carries. At the fastest rate, a mitochondrion manufactured in the cell body near the spine reaches the toe in 3 to 5 days. Slow axonal transport moves cytoskeletal elements and soluble proteins at 1 to 5 millimeters per day. At the slowest rate, a structural protein reaches the toe in 200 to 1,000 days, 6 months to nearly 3 years for a single delivery. Nerve ending at the toe has zero local manufacturing capacity. Every structural component, every signaling molecule, every replacement mitochondrion arrives from a factory a meter away, through a delivery system whose fastest lane takes 3 days and whose slowest takes years. A supply chain this long and this slow is vulnerable to any disruption along its route, and the disruption arrives through the smallest blood vessels in the body. What supplies the axon along its route? Vasa nervorum. Arterioles and capillaries running alongside and penetrating into the nerve bundle, delivering oxygen and glucose to the axon and the Schwann cells along the entire length between spine and toe. Diameter approximately 50 to 100 micrometers. Among the smallest named blood vessels in the body, 50 times smaller than the penile arteries whose failure an early vascular warning signal in the diameter hierarchy. Poiseuille's law governs these vessels with that fourth power relationship that governs every tube in the body, a 10 micrometer layer of glycated endothelium, the Maillard chemistry that has stiffened the lens, the bladder wall, the valve leaflets, and every collagen-containing tissue this physics has touched, narrows a 100 micrometer vessel by 20%. 20% radius reduction through a fourth power relationship, 0.8 raised to the fourth power equals 0.41. A 59% reduction in blood flow through the vessels that supply oxygen and glucose to the nerve along its entire length. The identical 10 micrometer layer on a 4 mm coronary artery reduces the radius by 0.5%, a flow reduction too small to measure. Diameter hierarchy. The morning erections discussion described penile arteries failing before coronary arteries because smaller vessels narrow from less endothelial thickening extends below the scale that discussion covered. Vasa nervorum at 50 to 100 micrometers narrow first before any other named vessel in the body from the least amount of endothelial change. The numbness in the toes may be the earliest systemic vascular signal, arriving years before the coronary arteries narrow enough to produce symptoms the cardiologist would detect. Vasa nervorum narrow with age through advanced glycation chemistry that operates on every endothelium in the body. No diabetes required. Normal glucose exposure accumulated across 6 decades produces measurable glycation on the vasa nervorum endothelium. The process is cumulative and irreversible. Each advanced glycation end product cross-link that forms on the endothelial basement membrane is a permanent addition that no enzyme in the body can remove. The accumulation rate is proportional to the average glucose concentration the endothelium is exposed to over time, measurable clinically as glycated hemoglobin, identical molecule the blood test reports as a percentage that reflects the average glucose exposure over the preceding 3 months. A hemoglobin A1C of 5.5% means 5.5% of hemoglobin molecules have been glycated. The vasa nervorum endothelium glycates at a comparable rate, but the consequence on a 50 micrometer vessel is catastrophic, where identical rate on a 4 mm vessel is negligible, because Poiseuille tells you the flow consequence scales with the fourth power of the radius change. Elevated glucose accelerates the narrowing. Diabetic neuropathy is the fastest version of a process that runs in every aging body. The physics is identical between the diabetic and the non-diabetic. The timeline differs. The nerve, already at the end of the longest axonal transport chain in the body, simultaneously loses its along the route blood supply through vessels too small to survive the glycation chemistry that larger vessels tolerate for decades longer. Nerve vessel pathology in diabetic peripheral neuropathy follows this progression through measurable structural changes in the vessel wall. Endothelial basement membrane thickening, parasite degeneration, and luminal narrowing in the vasa nervorum precede detectable nerve fiber loss. Malik and colleagues documented these changes in Diabetologia. 2 supply systems. 1 nerve. Axonal transport from the cell body delivering manufactured components across the full nerve length. Vasa nervorum along the root, delivering oxygen and glucose at every point between spine and toe. 2 systems. 1 nerve, and the nerve's survival at its distal terminus depends on both systems reaching that terminus with enough supply to maintain the molecular machinery that keeps the ending alive and functional. Both systems degrade. Both degrade first at the last segment the supply reaches because both systems are subject to distance-dependent losses that accumulate along the full route from origin to terminus, and the terminus absorbs the cumulative deficit of every meter the supply must cross. Axonal transport loses delivery efficiency over distance because the molecular motors consume ATP along the route, and each meter of microtubule rail requires maintenance that the slow transport system must deliver in advance of the cargo that uses the rail. Vasa nervorum supply diminishes along the nerve's length because the cumulative glycation on the vessel wall increases with each centimeter of vessel the blood must traverse, reducing flow progressively from the proximal nerve segment to the distal terminus. And the pattern of failure that results maps to one variable, length. Why does the numbness always start in the toes and work upward? Every nerve in the body depends on axonal transport and vasa nervorum supply. When the supply degrades systemically through glucose damage, through vitamin B12 deficiency, through inflammatory processes, through alcohol toxicity, every nerve is affected simultaneously. But the longest nerves cross the failure threshold first because they have the longest supply chain and the most vulnerable terminus. A water main running from a pump station to the last house on the road. As the pump weakens, pressure drops progressively along the pipe. Friction between the flowing water and the pipe wall reduces pressure at every meter of distance, and the longer the pipe, the more friction loss accumulates before the flow reaches the endpoint. A short pipe from the pump to the nearest house loses minimal pressure to friction. A long pipe from the pump to the farthest house loses pressure continuously along its entire length, and the farthest endpoint receives whatever pressure remains after the cumulative friction of the full distance has been subtracted. The nerve works the same way. Axonal transport loses efficiency with distance as the molecular motors consume ATP along the route, and the vasa nervorum supply diminishes along the nerve's length as each segment of vessel wall absorbs some of the narrowing the glycation chemistry imposes. The house nearest the pump still has adequate pressure. The house at the end of the line, the farthest from the pump, drops below functional threshold first. The gradient of failure follows the distance from the pump. The stocking pattern on your feet is that gradient. The toes are the last house. The spine is the pump station. The numbness working upward from the toes is the threshold creeping closer to the pump as the supply continues to degrade. Each centimeter of inward progression represents the next shortest nerve segment crossing the failure threshold that the longer segments below it crossed months or years earlier. The spatial progression is the temporal progression. The pattern on your body is a clock, with the boundary between numb and normal marking exactly how far the supply failure has advanced along the length gradient. Length-dependent peripheral neuropathy follows this spatial gradient through a clinically predictable sequence. Stocking glove distribution maps to nerve length, with the longest fibers crossing the failure threshold at the lowest level of systemic insult, and shorter fibers following as the insult progresses. The pattern is the clinical signature of length-dependent failure, documented across decades of nerve conduction studies. Now, the fingertips follow the feet. The cervical to fingertip nerves span approximately 0.7 meters, the second longest nerves in the body after the lumbar to toe nerves at approximately 1 meter. When the supply degradation that produced the stocking pattern in the feet progresses further, the next longest supply chain crosses that threshold. The glove pattern appears. You did not develop a second disease. The same physics crossed the second longest nerve, producing symptoms in the fingertips months or years after the toes. I traced the length gradient across my own numbness pattern. The supply chain physics replaced the word circulation in my understanding. The tingling that started in the toes, the same tingling arriving in the fingertips 18 months later. Two locations, one physics, the longest nerves failed first, and the second longest followed on the same gradient. The pattern was the diagnosis. The length was the physics. The word circulation had been obscuring the mechanism the entire time. The length gradient explains where the numbness starts and how it progresses. But the tingling you feel carries specific information about what is failing at the cellular level, and the type of failure determines whether the damage can be reversed. What exactly fails first inside the nerve? What fails first inside the nerve, and why does it matter which type goes first? Peripheral nerves contain multiple fiber types bundled together, each type carrying different sensory information, and each type carrying a different vulnerability to supply failure. Small diameter fibers, the A delta and C fibers that carry pain sensation, temperature sensation, and autonomic signals, fail before large diameter fibers, the A beta fibers that carry touch, vibration, and proprioception. The vulnerability follows the surface area to volume ratio. Smaller fibers have proportionally more membrane surface requiring metabolic maintenance per unit of exoplasmic volume, and when the metabolic supply diminishes, they cross the failure threshold before the larger fibers whose ratio is more favorable. Small fiber neuropathy precedes large fiber involvement in the majority of length-dependent neuropathies. Pain and temperature sensation are lost before touch and vibration in the standard progression of peripheral nerve failure. Cashman and Bhargava confirmed this hierarchy in current opinion in neurology. Clinically, the sequence carries a danger the hierarchy creates. Pain sensation is the body's damage alarm. Temperature sensation prevents thermal injury. When the small fibers that carry these signals fail before the large fibers that carry touch, the foot retains the ability to feel pressure, but loses the ability to feel pain and temperature. You can feel the shoe pressing against the foot. You cannot feel the blister forming inside it. You can feel the floor beneath your sole. You cannot feel that the bath water is scalding. Alarm system goes silent. The foot becomes an unmonitored structure, a part of the body where injuries accumulate without the alarm system that would normally prompt you to respond. A pebble inside the shoe that a healthy foot would register as sharp discomfort after 3 steps goes undetected for an entire day of walking, producing a pressure wound on the sole that you discover only when you remove the shoe and see the damage. A blister from a tight shoe that a healthy foot would signal as friction pain within minutes grows for hours because the friction alarm never fires. The small fiber loss does not merely reduce sensation, it removes the early warning system that prevents the mechanical damage the foot sustains during every hour of weight-bearing activity from escalating into tissue injury the body cannot detect. And then the insulation that enables high-speed conduction in the large fibers that still function is also failing, through a mechanism that connects directly to the vasa nervorum supply the second section taught. Why does the tingling feel the way it does? Myelin. The FAT discussion described myelin as 70 to 80% lipid, the insulating sheath that enables saltatory conduction along myelinated nerve fibers. In peripheral nerves, Schwann cells maintain the myelin, each cell wrapping approximately 1 millimeter of axon in concentric layers of lipid-rich membrane. A nerve spanning the full distance from spine to toe requires approximately 1,000 Schwann cells arranged end to end, each one maintaining its own segment of insulation independently. When the vasa nervorum supply diminishes, the Schwann cells at the distal terminus from the nearest vascular supply lose metabolic support. A Schwann cell that cannot receive adequate oxygen and glucose through the narrowed vasa nervorum cannot maintain the energy-intensive process of myelin membrane synthesis and repair. The insulation degrades segmentally, individual Schwann cell territories losing their myelin wrapping, while adjacent segments with slightly better vascular supply remain intact. The nerve signal, propagating along the axon through saltatory conduction, jumping from one node of Ranvier to the next at velocities of 40 to 60 meters per second in healthy myelinated fibers, encounters gaps where the insulation has failed. At each gap, the signal must switch from the fast saltatory mode to the slow continuous mode, crawling across the bare axon at approximately 1 to 2 meters per second, a velocity reduction of approximately 30 to 60-fold. Each slow zone adds a delay of microseconds to milliseconds depending on the length of the demyelinated segment, and the delays accumulate across every gap the signal encounters along the full meter of axon. The brain, receiving the delayed and jittered signal from the affected nerve alongside normal speed signals from unaffected nerves in adjacent territories, cannot resolve the asynchronous input into a coherent sensation. The result is the buzzing, prickling quality of tingling, a real signal arriving at the wrong time interpreted by the cortex as electrical noise rather than clean sensory information. If 3 of the 1,000 Schwann cell segments along a nerve spanning the full distance have lost their myelin, the signal encounters 3 slow zones in an otherwise fast pathway. Each zone adds its delay. The cumulative timing jitter across multiple demyelinated segments produces the characteristic pins and needles sensation that differs from the clean absence of a fully dead nerve. The signal is arriving, but it is arriving wrong. Tingling you feel is that stuttering signal. Tingling is a nerve signal encountering gaps in its insulation and arriving at the brain with erratic timing that the sensory cortex interprets as the buzzing, prickling, pins and needles sensation you recognize. The physics is specific. The sensation is specific. The word circulation explains nothing about what is happening inside the nerve that produces the tingling, while the stuttering signal carries information about which stage the failure has reached, and the stage determines whether the damage sits inside a window where reversal is still possible. Demyelination, insulation lost but the axon underneath, still intact, is potentially reversible. Schwann cells retain the capacity to remyelinate if their blood supply is restored, rebuilding the insulation segment by segment around an axon that survived the supply disruption. Axonal degeneration, the axon itself dying back from the terminus toward the cell body, is far slower to recover. Axonal regeneration proceeds at approximately 1 millimeter per day. A nerve spanning the full length that has died back from the toe regenerates over months to years, If regeneration occurs at all, the distinction between tingling and fixed numbness carried different weight once I understood that one was the insulation failing and the other was the wire itself dying back. The window between the two stages is the window where intervention changes the outcome. Tingling stage, intermittent symptoms that come and go, that vary with position and time of day, that sometimes improve and sometimes worsen, is likely demyelination, the insulation failing while the wire underneath survives. The fixed numbness stage, constant absence of sensation that does not fluctuate, that does not improve with position change, that presents as a permanent blank rather than a buzzing signal, is likely axonal degeneration, the wire itself having died back. Distinction matters because the tingling stage sits inside the reversible window. Supply restoration during the demyelination phase through glucose control that reduces the glycation rate on the vasa nervorum endothelium, through B12 repletion for the vitamin that serves as an obligate cofactor in the methylation reactions Schwann cells require for myelin lipid synthesis, a deficiency that is independently common after 50 because gastric acid production declines with age and B12 absorption from dietary protein requires adequate gastric acid to liberate the vitamin from its protein binding. Through exercise-induced angiogenesis, the process by which sustained aerobic activity triggers the release of vascular endothelial growth factor from exercising muscle and surrounding tissue, stimulating endothelial cell proliferation and new capillary formation in the vasa nervorum network. Walking, the simplest sustained aerobic activity available, produces the growth factor release that drives new vessel formation in the peripheral nerve supply system, potentially opening new supply routes around the segments of vasa nervorum that have narrowed beyond recovery, can provide the metabolic support the Schwann cells need to remyelinate the segments they abandoned when their own supply was cut. The remyelination, when it occurs, restores the saltatory conduction the signal requires to arrive cleanly, and the tingling resolves as the insulation returns to each formerly bare segment. The fixed numbness stage sits outside the window, requiring axonal regeneration rather than remyelination, a process measured in millimeters per day across a distance measured in meters. Tingling stage is the signal that the insulation is failing, but the wire is still alive. The window is open. Fixed numbness closes the window, shifting the recovery timeline from weeks of remyelination to years of axonal regrowth. Numbness in the toes is a nerve problem. The nerve problem is a supply problem. And the supply problem, carried in the smallest blood vessels in the body, may be the earliest signal of a systemic vascular process that progresses upward through the diameter hierarchy over the following decade. Vasa nervorum at 50 to 100 micrometers narrow first, penile arteries at 1 to 2 millimeters narrow next, renal arterioles follow. Coronary arteries at 3 to 4 millimeters follow. Carotid arteries follow last. The diameter hierarchy predicts the sequence, and the sequence runs from smallest to largest because identical endothelial thickening that closes a 50 micrometer vessel by 20% barely dents a 4 millimeter vessel. The foot that went numb may be sounding the earliest alarm in a vascular timeline that will not reach the coronary arteries for another decade. The endothelial thickening that closed the vasa nervorum by 20% and produced the neuropathy is endothelial thickening that has closed the coronary arteries by less than 1% at the same point in time. The same chemistry, the same rate, the same millimeters of endothelial change. The difference in clinical consequence is entirely a function of the starting diameter. The small vessel is functionally narrowed, while the large vessel is barely affected, and the clinical symptom follows the functional narrowing. The numbness in the feet is the body's smallest vessel alarm, arriving at the earliest point in a progression that will reach larger vessels on a timeline the diameter hierarchy predicts. Peripheral neuropathy progresses through a length-dependent gradient that follows the anatomy you can trace on your own body. Metabolic and vascular insults produce length-dependent failure through the convergence of axonal transport vulnerability, vasa nervorum narrowing, and Schwann cell metabolic insufficiency. Feldman and colleagues established these mechanisms in Nature Review's disease primers. Whether the numbness you experience requires clinical evaluation, medication adjustment, glucose management, or nutritional supplementation is a determination your physician makes based on examination, nerve conduction testing, and metabolic workup. The physics teaches what is happening inside the nerve and its supply system. Your physician determines what is driving the supply failure in your specific case through examination, nerve conduction velocity testing that delivers a small electrical stimulus to the nerve at one point and measures how long the signal takes to arrive at a second point, a known distance away, calculating the conduction velocity in meters per second and identifying whether the slowing indicates demyelination, which produces dramatic velocity reduction because the signal must crawl through bare axon segments or axonal loss, which reduces the signal amplitude because fewer intact fibers contribute to the measured response, while the surviving fibers maintain their normal velocity through intact myelin, and metabolic workup that identifies whether glucose, B12, thyroid function, inflammatory markers, or other systemic factors are contributing to the supply degradation. The cause determines the intervention, and the intervention targets the supply system rather than the nerve itself. Glucose-driven neuropathy responds to glucose control. B12 deficiency responds to supplementation. Inflammatory neuropathy responds to treating the inflammatory source. Alcohol-related neuropathy responds to cessation. Each cause operates through a different pathway to the same endpoint, the supply degradation that starves the longest nerve first, and identifying the specific cause is what allows the physician to target the intervention at the source rather than treating the symptom at the endpoint. The physics teaches the mechanism. The physician identifies the cause and selects the response. Numbness started in the toes because the toes sit at the end of the longest supply line in the body. A single cell spanning a meter from spine to sole, fed by a factory a meter away through a transport system that takes days, supplied along its route by the smallest blood vessels in the body through vessels that narrow first from the least amount of endothelial change. The endpoint the supply must reach failed first. The pattern working inward is the length gradient of a supply chain losing pressure from its most distant endpoint, each centimeter of inward progression marking the next nerve segment crossing the threshold, the longer segments below it crossed first. The toes were always going to be the first to feel it.